Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us from across Canada and the globe. I'm Hannah Storm and I'm joining you from the UK. I'll be co-emceeing this event with Yolande James. This is the first of two virtual conversations. We're coming together to discuss the critical issue of online harassment of journalists and other professionals in our industry. Today we'll discuss the extent and forms of this threat, whereas next Tuesday we'll go over the results of an industry-wide Ipsos survey and look at the results of that in Canada. As we begin, I'd like to remind you that this event will be bilingual with simultaneous translation available. These sessions are recorded for our colleagues who are not able to join us live. Now, if I may introduce myself, I'm a media consultant specializing in journalism safety, be that online, physical, emotional, or digital, and the former director of the International News Safety Institute, and it's a real privilege to be with you here today. I've seen firsthand the rise in harassment and the impact it has had on the well-being of our colleagues and our industry, and I know many of you have seen the same. As devastating as this virtual violence is, we've also seen increased awareness and solidarity to counter this abuse, and this is something we wish to build on in this forum. So thank you again for joining us at this critical moment. And now, Yolande, over to you.
Merci beaucoup, Hannah, et bonjour tout le monde. Mon nom est Yolande James et je suis la directrice générale de la diversité et de l'inclusion à Radio-Canada et j'ai le plaisir de co-animer ce forum à partir de Montréal avec Hannah. Je souhaite tout d'abord reconnaître que les terres sur lesquelles je me trouve font partie du territoire actuel de Kanien'kehá:ka, territoire autochtone non cédé, qui a accueilli plusieurs nations autochtones, notamment comme lieu d'échange, de vie et de rassemblement à travers le temps. Comme cet événement est virtuel, je vous invite à prendre le temps de réfléchir à cette question là où vous vous trouvez présentement et aux moyens de faire avancer les efforts de la réconciliation avec les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis partout au Canada. Depuis que j'ai pris mes fonctions à CBC Radio-Canada, j'ai malheureusement constaté l'impact disproportionné du harcèlement en ligne envers les femmes et les groupes sous-représentés, une réalité qui a été largement documentée à l'échelle mondiale. Ce phénomène montre qu'il y a actuellement une volonté délibérée de faire taire certaines voix. C'est assez. Durant ce forum, nous aborderons des sujets sensibles qui pourraient résonner avec vos propres expériences. Si c'est le cas, n'hésitez pas à vous confier à une personne de confiance ou à utiliser les ressources disponibles dans votre organisation. Au Canada, vous pouvez vous aussi joindre au besoin le Centre des services de crise du Canada. Merci. Et maintenant, je cède la parole à Catherine Tate, présidente directrice générale de CBC Radio-Canada. À vous la parole, Catherine.
Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you, Hannah and Yolande, for your introduction and for agreeing to guide this important conversation. As Canada's public broadcaster, CBC Radio-Canada has the unique responsibility to reflect all the diverse cultures, languages, and perspectives of Indigenous peoples and of all people in Canada. We do this by seeking to engage journalists from a wide range of backgrounds and perspectives. Unfortunately, as Yolande said, Indigenous, racialized, and LGBTQ2+ media professionals often face the greatest abuse for simply doing their jobs. We must protect all media professionals and their crews from harassment and violence. Les menaces en ligne ont des conséquences dans le monde réel. Nous savons que des journalistes, des animateurs et d'autres travailleurs du secteur quittent l'industrie en raison du harcèlement dont ils sont victimes. Le fait que des professionnels des médias renoncent à leur carrière ou bien s'empêchent de traiter certains sujets appauvrit la diversité des points de vue dans nos salles de nouvelles. Et les trolls ne sont pas la seule menace. Certaines attaques sont aussi menées de façon coordonnée par des groupes mal intentionnés. Ce type de harcèlement affaiblit la liberté de la presse et les fondements même de notre démocratie. C'est pourquoi votre présence aujourd'hui est si importante. This forum is part of a larger movement to protect media professionals from online violence. In Canada and around the world, we're seeing encouraging momentum to stop these attacks. Last month, the journalists Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to safeguard freedom of expression. Also last month, 37 Canadian news media organizations came together to release a joint statement condemning online harassment of journalists. And earlier this fall, more than 40 public broadcasters and media organizations from around the world signed the Brussels Declaration demonstrating their commitment to supporting media professionals' safety and freedom of the press. Our forum is situated in the context of this truly global movement, and it is part of the ongoing work to combat online harassment that will continue beyond November 9th. CBC Radio-Canada is committed to working with other media to raise awareness of the issue, and most urgently to propose concrete steps to reduce it. It won't be easy and it won't happen overnight, but we must do more to protect journalists. Enough is enough. We must act together for a safer, stronger media. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Before we introduce you to our first panelist, I'd like to call your attention to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We invite you to share your feedback, thoughts, and questions throughout the event. Moderators will keep a close eye on it throughout the forum and will share the information with me and with Yolande. So let's begin. Joining us now are Dr. Julie Posetti, Global Director of Research for the International Center for Journalists, and David Kaye, Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine, and the former Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. Thank you so much both for joining us. You are both two experts in this field, and it's such a privilege to have you as part of this conversation. I'd like to begin with you, Julie, and I'd like to talk a little bit about this global study that you've been recently leading, the Chilling, on the online violence against women journalists. You're going to run us through some of the findings from that study.
I am, and I'm going to attempt to share my screen, Hannah and colleagues, so bear with me please while I do that. And the reason for sharing my screen is to ensure that I can provide some data to underpin what I'm saying, and I think data is one of the more powerful things we have in our kit to combat online violence against women journalists. It's hard to argue with facts and statistics. And I want to echo what was just said about the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded for acts of journalism in this past few weeks. One of the recipients was Maria Ressa, who has actually been at the forefront of attempts to call out and combat gender-based online violence against journalists from the Philippines. In fact, her work in trying to hold powerful tech companies to account and to call out these attacks is featured in the description of the justification for her award. And here's a comment that she made after receiving news of being a Nobel laureate, and that is to say that what she has experienced in the Philippines is a stark example of a global trend. So what I'm going to share with you is some data from a global study I've been leading for the International Center for Journalists and UNESCO, looking at the scale, intensity, and spread of this scourge. So we did a survey of around 715 women journalists from around the world. A very diverse range of countries were represented. And we found that of those 715 odd women journalists who responded, 73% said that they had experienced online violence in the course of their work. And we deliberately chose to use the term online violence to highlight the fact that these acts, these threats of sexualized violence, these threats of murder, horrible instances of harassment coming in various forms, and you can see some of the examples there on the screen, from hateful messages that are received in a public domain through to attempts to target journalists through direct messages, for example, where perpetrators can act with relative impunity. And so it was important to highlight that this is a very widespread problem. It's a genuinely global problem. And we studied 15 countries around the world to demonstrate the ways in which this manifests. But it's a problem that is misogynistic at its core, but one which is exponentially worse at the intersection of other forms of discrimination and hate. So we found, for example, that while white women journalists were targeted at the rate of 64% of participants, Black women journalists, Indigenous women journalists, Jewish women journalists, and women of different sexual orientation were much more likely to experience online violence than the white straight women journalists in our data set. So it's at this nexus of religious bigotry and race-based hate that the impacts and the incidents of online violence tend to be most severe. We also found that the impacts were pretty universal. Women around the world highlighted mental health impacts as the most significant of their experiences. Around 26% of respondents said that that was the number one impact. It's also important to note that in answer to another question, 30% said that they self-censored in response to online violence. And we found other evidence that women are withdrawing from public spaces, even asking for their bylines to be removed from stories, handing stories off to other journalists to avoid the attacks that they know will follow, asking to be removed from on-air roles. This demonstrates what a serious threat to freedom of expression this problem is. And one of the most significant risks is the potential for online attacks to escalate into offline violence. So we found 20% of our survey respondents said they had been abused or attacked offline, that is in the physical world, in connection with online violence. And that came in a variety of forms, from physical assault through to legal harassment, orchestrated, state-linked legal harassment campaigns, which are very much real experiences of digital violence. Again, though, this wasn't uniform. So among our respondents who were identifying themselves as Arab, 53%, over half, said that they had experienced this phenomenon of escalation of online violence into the offline space. It also works both ways. So when we see politicians, for example, calling out women journalists, abusing them, in a press conference scenario, for example, we see the online pylons escalate in response, and then that spills back offline potentially. Here is a detail of a case study that we did on Maria Ress. So we examined 500,000 posts on Facebook and Twitter over a period of 5 years. And we found that she suffered the most intense misogynistic abuse, often racialized. She was frequently portrayed as a monkey. Her sexuality was critiqued. She was the subject of a whole range of personalized abuse, but overwhelmingly, the abuse that she suffered, about 60% of it, was designed to chill her journalism, to undercut public trust in her reporting. And you can see from this word cloud that while the misogynistic and racist hate swirled, it often swirled in combination with accusations that she was a liar. So disinformation tactics to portray her as a fake news purveyor were part of the suite of the problems that she experienced. And we found that 41% of our survey respondents had experienced online violence in connection with orchestrated disinformation campaigns. And I'll leave it there, Hannah, just to give you some context for this discussion on a global scale.
Thank you, Julie. And so many facts there, so striking and so chilling, as you say. I'm really grateful, Julie, to you for sharing that, and wish you a lot of luck in the continued work that you're doing, the really important work. David, I just want to pick up on that last slide of Julie's talking about disinformation. We know that lots of narratives are being seeded against journalists to try to not only undermine the individual journalist, but our industry at large. And that's having a negative impact on freedom of expression, on democracy as well. How do you see that playing out in the world?
Yeah, Hannah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. And thanks especially to Julie for all of her work, not just the work that we've just seen today, this morning here in California, but over the last many years. Really, Julie, you're a leader in this space. One of the things that I would start by highlighting is the human rights principles that are at issue here, right? So Julie mentioned this in the last slide, right? The purpose of so much of the misogyny and harassment online and offline is designed to push women off platforms, to push journalism off platforms, to silence and intimidate voices. This isn't random harassment. I mean, this is harassment that has a real design at its heart. And when you think about the nature of freedom of expression, right? The right to freedom of expression as codified in international human rights law, it's a protection and a guarantee of freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any media. And I want to just focus for a moment on that seek, receive, and impart part of the equation. Because when you think about what misogyny and other online violence and harassment is doing, it is not merely, although this is the most direct impact, not merely directed at particular individuals, right? It is also directed at all of our right to seek and receive information. And when we think about online harms like this in that way, I think it allows us to see not just the individual harm caused by this kind of misogyny and attack, but we also see the social, the public harm, the harm to public participation, to governance, to our ability to maintain democratic institutions and free and fair public debate. And so I think framing the issue only as an attack on specific individuals, as detestable as that is, I think misses the broader perspective. And I think this is the perspective that Julie's research is leading us towards, which is this is a public harm that needs to be dealt with. Now, the kinds of harms that we face need to be dealt with in an appropriate way. And we can talk a little bit about that, but I think the research really highlights the threat to freedom of expression that is essential to public debate and our access to information.
Thank you, David. I'd just like to press you a bit further. How do we balance the challenges, I suppose, of protecting and promoting freedom of expression with this need to regulate online harm and online violence, to end that in some ways, in some shape or form? So how do we find that kind of balance? And the other question I'd like to pose to you both at the moment is that we've come together today to have a global but Canada-based conversation about what we can do to recognize this, what we can do together to try to counter this. So before we close, I would like to ask you for your suggestions in terms of practical things that people might be considering, either in their newsrooms or individually or legislatively wise, for people to kind of how we can counter this together. But back to the question about how do we balance that need to protect and promote freedom of expression, but also to regulate online harm?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it's a thorny one, right? Solutions can be very difficult. I think we need to be honest about that. I think one thing to recognize, and this is particularly evident in the case of Maria Ressa, is how coordinated the attacks on some journalists, not all journalists, but on some journalists may be. You know, the situation in the Philippines has been that Maria Ressa has been subject to assault in a way that has been not only directed at the highest levels of government by the Duterte government, but also through hints and other forms of coordination have been sort of directed at her and her team at Rappler in order to silence their voices, to silence their reporting, to silence the kind of criticism that might come from their reporting. So, you know, a first step is to kind of name and identify sources of harm. And I think that's one thing that we've seen. But I think also we have to recognize that so much of this, you know, this environment of attack is taking place in online forums, on online platforms. And it's taken the platforms, the biggest platforms, I think many years to realize that misogynistic attacks and hate speech, other forms of attacks, are not merely some kind of speech that they should, you know, let happen because of this, you know, the sacred quality of expression. You know, it's taken them a while, though I think they are getting to a point where they understand that attacks like this are also threats to everyone's right to freedom of expression. And when they see it that way, it allows them at least to start to take steps to limit the attacks, while at the same time doing it in a way that you're suggesting is the core problem, which is how do you do that in a proportionate way? In other words, how do you deal with the attacks and create rules and policies to deal with those attacks while not silencing those who are raising concerns about those attacks, who are using terms and other forms of speech in order to create solidarity? How do you create that space for sharing of information and creating solidarity while at the same time dealing with the misogyny? It sounds like an easy problem to solve, right? If there's misogyny, just shut it down, silence it. But all too often that leads to the companies over regulating and actually taking down content from the very people who are the victims of these assaults. And that's the area where we need to be working. And so I think this does require, as a first measure, companies being transparent about their rules, companies engaging in a very real, robust way with stakeholders, that is journalists, with groups that are dedicated to promoting voices of those who are either underrepresented or regularly subject to attack. And it requires, I think, working with other stakeholders, including with government, to identify the mechanisms for oversight that don't involve government in deciding what's legitimate and what's illegitimate content or speech in the public square.
Thanks, David. I'm going to come back to you in a moment about what those mechanisms for accountability might look like. But Julie, I want to come back to you because you talk about network misogyny, and you also talk significantly, and it's something that I know from my own work in journalism safety, how frequently in gendered violence people are blamed for the things that happen to them. And you talk about this in online harassment terms. How can we work to counter that, given this victim blaming that's taken place, if we want to use the term victim, of course, and this kind of network misogyny? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts go like this, that women journalists have been forced to bear the brunt of responding to the attacks that they endure, just as women's behaviour is policed in reference to physical and sexual assault, domestic violence. The same has been true with regards to online violence against women journalists. So the onus has been on them to respond, to change their behaviour, to block, mute, delete. Many of these habits are part of the kit that we have to try to protect ourselves. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't try to protect ourselves, but the core of the problem, that is the design and the business models underpinning the platform's conduct in reference to online violence against women journalists, must be dealt with. And that's how we've ended up in this thorny, gnarly discussion about regulation of the platforms, with all of the risks to freedom of expression that entails. Today is the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, and I see online violence as a mode of aiding and abetting impunity. the platforms have acted with impunity with regard to dealing with the problem, to the extent that it was only a couple of weeks ago that Facebook acknowledged that they had perhaps erred in reference to the way they deal with threats of murder against journalists. So only a couple of weeks ago did they change their policy to prevent threats of murder against journalists on their platform. I think that highlights for us how difficult this situation is. What it means for journalists and news organizations, for the profession, is that we need to do what this event is trying to achieve, that is to facilitate solidarity and collaboration. That, of course, means that we need to use the tools of journalism, investigative reporting, to hold the platforms to account. And we're starting to see a real shift in that regard. A lot of attention now being placed on the failure of the platforms to deal with this problem effectively through self-regulation. But we also need political actors to take responsibility for their own behavior and to recognize the ways in which their conduct, when they demonize journalists, when they use misogynistic hate speech to try to chill critical reporting of their governments or their policies, that this places journalists' lives at risk, and especially women who are more vulnerable to other forms of offline attacks, sexual assault, for example. And just to go back to that data, 37% of our respondents in the survey said that they could identify political actors, so elected officials, spokespeople for political organizations, as perpetrators of online violence. So those, we need to put the emphasis on changing the behavior of the instigators and perpetrators, and at the same time demand accountability as well as transparency from the platforms, I think.
Thank you, Julie. And I'll come back to you again before we close about this idea of what news organizations can do to support people to be able to speak more openly about their experiences, because we do know that very few people who encounter this abuse feel safe to be able to speak openly about it. But David, to you, we spoke briefly before about mechanisms of accountability. What might they look like?
It's a really good question. I mean, there's different forms of accountability, right? I mean, there are the forms of accountability that we could demand of the platforms. So Julie was alluding to some of this kind of change in the rules at this extraordinarily, I mean, shockingly late date on some of these issues. I think one of the forms of accountability that you would get from transparency is a better idea of how the companies are dealing with these problems. And then sort of the next step would be the community of people like Julie, like others who are active in this space, to understand exactly how different kinds of attacks are coordinated and whether or not those individual networks and individuals are actually continually allowed to maintain their own space on the platforms. So one form of accountability is, taking down accounts that are responsible for attacks on journalists, right? That's in some respects, that's an easy, almost a kind of low-hanging fruit for the companies to do. And there needs to be more clarity about how they do that. Now, there's a very active debate worldwide, but including in countries like Canada, in the UK, in the United States, about when should the platforms be held liable? I mean, really, responsible for the harms that take place on their platforms. And that's, I think, a very complicated place to be thinking about accountability, but we do need to be thinking about it. I mean, my own view is that government regulation should start with essentially requiring the companies to be more open about their rules, about their algorithmic recommendation systems, how they enable certain kinds of attacks to go viral, to continue. That in itself could be a form of accountability, and that I think would be extremely embarrassing to many of the companies once you see exactly how this operates. I'm less sure that holding them directly accountable in the sense of requiring them to take certain steps to take down content at the risk of significant fines is going to be the solution that works for us. My concern there is that the companies will ultimately over-rotate in a way. They will end up taking down the kind of content that is actually supportive of journalists, of women, of underrepresented communities. We've seen this happen in places around the world. So it goes back to your original question about how do we find the balance? And for me, the first place is to kind of crack them open, make them more amenable to public scrutiny.
Thanks, David. And I don't know about anybody else on this conversation, as part of this conversation, but I think anybody who's had anything to do with the platforms will recognize the fact that they are not as transparent as they need to be. Julie, I remember us having a conversation, goodness, probably 6-7 years ago, about the need for solidarity in the industry and the idea that we were stronger together than we were as individual parts in terms of journalism organizations. So just in terms of kind of wrapping up this conversation, I'd love to hear your insights in terms of what specifically the news organizations can do to encourage people to feel safer, but then also what we as an industry can do. And you've done so much work on this already to just try to create solidarity to counter this abuse.
Just let me give you a couple more statistics because I think they're helpful from the research to shape this answer. So among our survey respondents, only 25% of the women journalists said they had reported episodes of online violence that they had experienced to their employers. I think that remains a really serious challenge for the profession. We know that journalism, especially news reporting, has typically been a male-dominated and unfortunately patriarchal and at times misogynistic place and space for women journalists. That needs to shift still. A lot of work needs to be done. It's brilliant that those participating in this event have clearly started to grapple with that problem and address it proactively. Among that 25% who did report the problem, 10% said their employers did nothing in response, and 9% said that they were told to grow a thicker skin, which gets back to this victim blaming problem. And I think we still have substantial work to do on that score. An alarming but small proportion of people, also women, also said they were asked specifically by their employers what they did to provoke the attacks. That points to a really big challenge, that is to ensure that women are not being blamed and they're not being made responsible for the attacks that they endure. And one of the key challenges that we've seen in this research and an area that we're calling for action on is actually to ensure that speech policing of women's online conduct, women journalists' online conduct, isn't used to try to address the problem. So women need to feel free to speak about their experiences and to share them publicly where they choose to, and to speak back to their attackers with all of the caveats around the need for general respectful behaviour, and not to feel guilty or afraid of any kind of sanctions with regard to their employment being brought into play. And that's something that news organisations can do, and that this sort of event is hopefully encouraging. On top of that, just one final point, unfortunately, we saw substantial evidence, particularly in Western contexts, of partisan news media and high-profile male journalists instigating and joining in the pylons on women journalists. That is something that is utterly intolerable. And at the same time as we're saying women journalists need to be given the liberty to speak back and to speak up, there needs to be a recognition that journalists perpetrating any form of hate speech is utterly unacceptable and counterproductive and needs to be dealt with. I think I'll leave it there for now, Hannah.
Thank you, Julie. And to your point, your final point, one of our hopes here is that we are making strides into normalizing the conversation, to normalizing the idea that online violence against journalists is completely unacceptable. It should not be part of our job. It is not part of our jobs. So we need to be able to speak out about that. And to both of you, thank you so much for such a wide-ranging, fantastic conversation. I could have sat and talked to you for the rest of the day. I know you're incredibly busy people. We're very grateful to you. Thank you so much again, David and Julie. We hope to hear more of you in the future and work with you again in the future as well. Yolande, back over to you.
Wow. Merci beaucoup, Anna. Et c'était vraiment extraordinaire d'entendre la voix des panélistes, notamment sur toute la question du data et l'impact. Maintenant, je pense qu'on s'entend pour dire qu'on veut agir, c'est l'importance d'agir et poser des gestes concrets et vraiment, c'est important d'être au rendez-vous. Mais avant de le faire, un des objectifs du forum, c'est d'être capable de vraiment comprendre la réalité du quotidien des gens qui vivent ce type d'harcèlement en ligne. Alors, au courant des prochaines minutes, nous aurons cette occasion d'entendre les voix de l'expérience canadienne. Je vous présente sans plus tarder les panélistes pour cette table ronde. Tout d'abord, Joanna Chu, reporter at the Toronto Star, Omaira Issa, reporter at the CBC, Bouchroy Watik, reporter national à la Radio-Canada, et Tristan Péloquin, journaliste à la presse. Welcome and thank you to all of you, all four of you, for being here. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So, you know, I think I want to get started with you, Joanna, if I could, because I know that you've written quite a bit on the subject, and it's so important as we think about how we can work together to understand what your experiences are, all four of you. But I'll start with you, Joanna, if you can kind of just walk us through your experience. And I'd like to hear you specifically about at what moment in time did you realize, hold on a second here, this is not normal. This is not within the parameters of what is in my job description.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me in this really important forum. And I was just nodding along with everything that Julie and David said, because I'm so glad that this was said, and not just by journalists ourselves, but by experts, because that really helps lend credibility to our voices. Like the more like validation of our experiences there can be, I think that is really helpful, because one of the problems is that it's really been up to often racialized women journalists of color to talk about our experiences. And I'm happy to do so, but in this space where we have allies who can back up what we're saying, that's so important. So your question, like, when did I realize this wasn't normal? So I was a correspondent in China for 7 years for international media outlets, and actually reporting from overseas to an international audience. Mostly I worked for European media. I didn't get as much of the harassment at the time, even though it was pretty high profile. I was reporting on just major events, sensitive events, including in China on human rights. It was actually when I returned to Canada that things got really bad. So I guess I can provide this outsider perspective where there might be something particular about our Canadian social media landscape that can get so nasty and so personal so quickly, and that I found particularly misogynist and racist. And that's something that, you know, people might feel surprised about, because we have the stereotype of polite Canadians, but in fact I've written for many countries media, and you know, going back home to Vancouver, like it was just really ridiculous. And for the Toronto Star, starting in late 2018, I was managing a newsroom of 12 reporters, and actually most of us were people of color or came from immigrant families. I think half of us came from immigrant families. And it was really interesting because we'd often work together on stories, 2 or 3 bylines, sometimes 4 bylines. And it didn't really matter what topic it was. It could be something pretty innocuous about an environment, for example. And online harassment and the trolls would come after always the woman journalist, way more than the male journalist, even if they shared a byline, even if the man's byline happened to be the first one. So I think that was really eye-opening for many of the men in our newsroom, that they could do exactly the same job as their women and BIPOC colleagues. And while they would get praise or not much feedback, the woman for some reason would just get a storm of just toxic responses. Sometimes it would range from subtle, like people, you know, trying to tell us how to do our jobs, or kind of condescending, or it would get to where it would get really ugly, rape threats, death threats. That's things that we had to deal with as a newsroom. And for the last year and a half, I've been a national correspondent for Toronto Star, so focusing more on writing myself and focusing on covering the Canada-China relationship, as well as, you know, Canada's place in the world more broadly, talking about, you know, India, for example. So I realized that things were really bad when I realized I was putting together like a file for my editor of threats I've received in the past. And I actually came over death threats that I had forgotten about, months ago. So the fact that I forgot about receiving some of these and only, remember when I put together these screenshots, because at the Toronto Star, we're trying to learn more about what's happening, and my editor asked me to look these up. I thought that was a problem, and we had a discussion about how I should at least go to the police to get the police to file a report. So I spent a lot of time compiling like these attacks on me. And I had a book out recently, China Unbound, which focuses on human rights and criticizes the Western response to China's human rights issues and political issues. And just before the release of that book, my online attackers not only attacked me, but they found the emails of only my female editors and publishers and sent them messages alleging that I was an ISIS terrorist, sending all sorts of strange pictures. So I found that was interesting that they targeted not only me as a female journalist, but my female editors, not my male supervisors. That was really striking, like the gendered approach to all of this. Even when it has something to do with something that's not about gender, it's about, I write about geopolitics of China and Western relationships. So I did, that was kind of the last straw for me, that they weren't just going after me, but my colleagues trying to smear my reputation. In addition to death threats, someone said that I should get my neck ready because they were coming over to my house, to allege that they were kind of come behead me, which is, horrifying. I should have remembered that, but I had forgotten about it because I got such a torrent of these messages. So I reported these to police, and the police officer, was really nice. They said, this is terrible, this is happening to you, but they were really honest about what they can do in these situations. And the constable told me that judges are hesitant to allow police to access information about an online commenter's or emailer's IP address unless they think there's imminent threat to someone's safety. And I said, these are death threats. That's an imminent threat to my safety. But that, the police like, no, like the judge probably wouldn't take that. So they say, I asked, is there a unit focused on these attacks online? And police said the cybercrime unit is mostly focused on economic crime. So fraud, people trying to steal your money, not try to attack you or threaten to kill you online. And there's no basically specific department. I asked the Minister of Public Safety, again, Julie was talking about using our journalistic skills to try to find out more, like what can people do? Because it's not only journalists who get these threats, it's people in all sorts of fields. I wrote a piece called in the Toronto Star, it was front page, titled, I've lost track of how many threats I've received. That's how common online hate is. And not only shared my own experience, but spoke with NGO workers, spoke with writers, spoke with professors of law, all experienced similar things. And the Minister of Public Safety, Bill Blair, he said Canadians who experience this should go to the police. So it feels like it's really circular.
There's so much to unpack on what you've said, and I'll come back to you notably on the question of how that was a coping mechanism for you to just forget that, the depths of those threats. Mais je vais peut-être passer la parole à toi, Bouchra, pour nous parler un peu de ton expérience, comment tu vis l'harcèlement en ligne et comment ça a façonné la façon que tu travailles, tu as dû adapter ta façon de travailler. Mais d'abord, sur ton expérience.
Mais moi, ça a vraiment été à partir du début de la pandémie, c'est-à-dire que c'était arrivé auparavant de temps en temps quand je couvrais un sujet un peu controversé, que je reçoive un message haineux et évidemment, souvent quand on est une femme et une femme de couleur, il y a des insultes misogynes et racistes dans le message haineux, mais c'était assez sporadique jusqu'à temps que je me joigne à l'équipe des décrypteurs. Et que la pandémie arrive. Parce qu'au début, les décrypteurs, on couvrait la désinformation en général, mais avant la pandémie, c'était des choses assez anodines, donc des vidéos virales, des trucs, un peu des légendes urbaines, mais on recevait très peu de messages haineux et on voulait vraiment, avec les décrypteurs, avoir un dialogue avec le public. Donc, on avait créé un groupe où les gens pouvaient réagir aux articles qu'on commentait. Mais à partir de janvier 2020, donc, il a commencé à avoir toutes ces histoires de le virus a été créé en laboratoire. Et je dirais, à partir de ce moment-là, 100% de ce qu'on couvrait comme sujet était lié à démentir des fausses histoires liées à la pandémie. Et ça allait de faux remèdes jusqu'à des histoires comme quoi le gouvernement avait créé le virus, jusqu'à QAnon, comme quoi tous les puissants du monde étaient dans une cabale pédosataniste. Et graduellement, on a vraiment commencé à avoir beaucoup de réactions très violentes à nos démentis. Beaucoup de gens ont commencé à se construire un narratif comme quoi les médias en général étaient tous vendus à l'élite, donc au gouvernement, à Bill Gates, et qu'on était des complices. Donc, de ce que je comprends de leur point de vue, surtout ceux qui croyaient qu'il y avait une élite sataniste, ils nous voyaient vraiment comme des complices de ceux qui s'attaquent aux enfants. Là. Donc, si je me mets dans la tête de ces gens-là, on était vraiment vus comme des gens extrêmement maléfiques, et la haine qu'on recevait reflétait ça. Et à partir de ce moment-là, le dialogue avec le public est devenu presque impossible, parce que dans le groupe Facebook qu'on avait créé, qui avait à peu près 40 000 personnes, il y avait tellement de messages haineux qu'on a dû fermer les commentaires parce qu'on ne pouvait plus modérer ça. Et on a commencé à avoir beaucoup de courriels et de messages sur les réseaux sociaux haineux. Et c'est devenu vraiment des menaces assez concrètes. Là. Donc, beaucoup de gens, donc pas seulement moi, mais aussi Jeff Yates, Alexis Delancère, qui étaient à ce moment-là, là, donc en 2020, mes collègues au décrypteur, on recevait des messages qui nous associaient au collabo après la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Donc, il y avait vraiment des connotations de, vous savez ce qui est arrivé au collabo, dans le sens que une fois que la pandémie va être finie et que la vérité va éclater au grand jour, vous allez être éliminé. Et des fois, c'est des messages un peu, des menaces sous-entendues, mais il y a eu des fois où c'était assez explicite, là, où c'était vraiment, vous méritez d'être pendu. Donc, je sais qu'il y a eu des fois où on a dû faire appel d'abord à nos gestionnaires ou responsables de la sécurité à Radio-Canada, et rapidement, on nous a conseillé de contacter la police. Donc, moi, c'est arrivé une fois, au moins, que j'ai dû contacter la police parce qu'il y avait un internaute qui m'envoyait des messages répétés à la suite d'un article où je parlais justement de pourquoi est-ce qu'on devient conspirationniste. Et ces messages étaient devenaient tellement précis, c'est vraiment des menaces très claires et on savait que c'était quelqu'un qui habitait à Montréal. Donc étonnamment, la police a intervenu quand même assez rapidement, parce que je sais que dans le passé, pour ce qui est menaces en ligne, c'était pas toujours facile de déposer plainte, ou c'était pas toujours facile d'être pris au sérieux quand c'était une menace par courriel. Mais dans ce cas-ci, il y a vraiment une intervention assez rapide. Donc, l'enquêteur m'a tenu au courant que la personne a été arrêtée. Il y avait une date de comparution qui était prévue. Finalement, après quelques semaines, les accusations ont été abandonnées. Mais au moins, je me dis, bon, ça fait au moins une personne qui a peut-être pris conscience qu'on ne peut pas faire des menaces de mort impunément, parce que je pense que beaucoup de gens ont l'impression qu'ils peuvent déverser leur frustration sur les réseaux sociaux sans conséquence. Puis je suis loin d'être la seule journaliste. Je le vois énormément. Je sais qu'il y a d'autres journalistes qui vont, eux, partager sur leurs réseaux sociaux les messages haineux qu'ils reçoivent pour un peu essayer de dénoncer ces gens-là. Donc, je sais que d'autres collègues aussi ont dû faire appel à la police. Dans certains cas aussi, c'était des gens qui venaient d'Europe, de France, parce que ce qui est arrivé avec la COVID, c'est qu'il y a beaucoup d'influenceurs conspirationnistes québécois qui avaient un très grand auditoire en France. Et donc, des gens en France connaissaient les décrypteurs et donc nous écrivaient de la France pour nous envoyer des messages haineux. Donc, comme nous, on publiait uniquement en français, donc toute la francophonie finissait par être au courant de ce qu'on faisait, surtout que beaucoup d'influenceurs conspirationnistes, à la longue, nous nommaient dans leur direct, dans leurs vidéos sur YouTube, disaient, bon, les décrypteurs vont encore s'en prendre à nous parce qu'on dit la vérité. Donc, ça a été quand même quelques mois assez stressants. Pour ma part, en ce moment, dans la dernière année, j'ai changé d'affectation. Donc, en ce moment, je suis à découverte. Donc, j'ai moins à gérer. Je suis moins dans le beat de la désinformation. Je sais que mes collègues qui sont encore là-dedans trouvent ça encore très lourd et c'est dommage parce que c'est des gens qui aiment leur travail, qui aiment parler de ça, mais c'est comme si inévitablement le prix à payer est de recevoir des menaces, des insultes. Je dirais que pour ma part, la principale inquiétude que j'avais n'était pas tant de recevoir de la violence directe, mais c'était surtout la crainte d'être doxée, d'être hacké. Parce que je me disais, bon, c'est des gens qui ne savent pas forcément où j'habite, des gens qui ne sont même pas nécessairement à Montréal, mais j'ai commencé à m'inquiéter par rapport à la sécurité de mes réseaux sociaux. Je me suis dit, est-ce qu'il y avait des messages des fois qui disaient, bon, on va essayer de les hacker, tu sais. Donc, je me suis dit, est-ce que mes informations personnelles pourraient se retrouver en ligne? Donc, j'ai commencé à voir comment je peux me protéger en ligne pour éviter justement de me faire attaquer par voie électronique. On a aussi eu, on était partenaire de Facebook, là, donc du programme de vérification des faits de Facebook où lorsqu'il y a une information qui est fausse, il y avait un article des décrypteurs qui apparaissait pour dire à la personne qui a partagé l'information que c'était faux. Et ça, à un moment donné, on s'est rendu compte que ça nous positionnait aussi comme cible parce que là, les gens qui partageaient ces fausses informations se faisaient tout de suite dire « les décrypteurs ont vérifié cette information et elle est fausse ». Et ça nous a aussi apporté des détracteurs. Donc, à un moment donné…
Au lieu de rassurer les gens, ça fait en sorte que les gens ont comme… ils ont eu encore davantage une croyance que c'était de la désinformation. Autrement
oui,
dit,
parce que les gens qui partagent ces fausses informations, eux, ils y croient à 100%. Donc, de se faire dire qu'un média, qui déjà pour eux, les médias, ça représente l'ennemi, de se faire dire qu'un média les contredit, ils n'y croient pas. Donc, et en fait, bon, les gens ne comprenaient pas nécessairement comment l'écosystème de Facebook comprenait. Donc, ces avertissements apparaissaient de façon automatique, mais les gens avaient l'impression qu'on avait épié leur profil privé. Donc, les gens me disaient que j'ai publié quelque chose sur mon profil juste pour mes amis, puis là, vous êtes venus mettre un article comme quoi c'est faux. Mais nous, à travers le système de Facebook, Facebook reconnaît certains liens, certaines images et automatiquement appose l'avertissement. Donc, on n'a pas accès au profil privé des gens, mais donc, on a eu des fois des critiques par rapport à la façon de faire de Facebook, que c'était pas forcément clair pour les gens comment ça fonctionnait. Donc, à la limite, plutôt que d'être en colère contre Facebook, les gens étaient en colère contre le média qui était l'auteur de l'article qu'ils voyaient apparaître. Donc, ils avaient l'impression qu'on avait épié leur profil. Ils avaient l'impression qu'on venait donc les attaquer sur leur terrain. Et ça faisait aussi que des gens qui n'étaient pas dans notre public cible là, entendaient parler de nous, mais d'une façon qui attisait leur colère parce qu'ils disaient, bon, je partage la vérité à mes amis, puis là, un média collabo vient me dire que c'est faux. Donc, il y a eu vraiment une très, très grande perte de confiance envers les médias à travers la pandémie. Et cette perte de confiance-là, chez certains gens, c'est vraiment transformé en haine viscérale envers tous les grands médias.
Je comprends, très éclairant. Je vois notamment le lien entre la présentation de Julie il y a quelques instants où le fait que ton mandat autour des décrypteurs était de la désinformation. En fait, toutes les menaces ont, d'une certaine façon, été coordonnées à travers tout ça aussi. Alors, l'impact est comme pire. Alors, c'est intéressant de voir par la suite comment vous avez dû ajuster votre façon de travailler. Peut-être pour faire le lien with you, Amira, to hear, COVID and Bushra was talking about it a few minutes ago, has also, in certain ways, created the perfect storm where we're more online than we've ever been. Have you found, as you tell us about your own experience in online hate, that has COVID made it worse, and how for you?
You know what, that's a really important question. I have to say that in my own experience, in the past, I would receive hate mail every once in a while. But recently, I've received a string of hateful messages that were particularly racist and sexist and anti-immigrant sentiment. And some of the messages were actually attacking my work very specifically. And so what Julie was saying about the research was very resonant with me, because it showed in the research how there is an intersection when it comes to the attacks that particularly women of color are receiving, and particularly Black women. And so as a Black journalist, I was receiving very, very targeted language. And what was particularly unsettling to me is the fact that historically, the messages that I was receiving, the language was not particularly violent. But in the most recent messages I was receiving, the language was particularly violent and particularly virulent, with some threats, some veiled threats towards me. And so that was very unsettling, and it signaled to me that something different is happening right now that wasn't happening before. And in terms of the impact on me, I'm going to be very candid here. It had a really serious impact on me because it was in many ways unsettling. And so what happened to me is that for a few days, it unsettled me, it kind of scared me, particularly because I was concerned about my physical safety, but I was also concerned about my online safety. Was I going to be doxxed? Was I going to be hacked? Was there going to be more of a targeted campaign against me? And so those were the concerns that I had. And I have to say that I realized in that moment that the goal was to unsettle me, the goal was to intimidate me. And it was at that moment when I realized that it was clear in my mind that I wasn't gonna let that happen, and that my work as a journalist, as a Canadian journalist in informing the Canadian public, was way more important to me than caving to that kind of behavior.
I hear you. Peut-être laisser maintenant, j'avais envie d'entendre Tristan sur ton expérience à la presse. Est-ce que la COVID en soi a fait en sorte, est-ce que ça crée l'espèce de tempête parfaite, ou comment tu as vu la situation évoluer dans ton travail?
Moi, je me suis un peu spécialisé pendant la COVID dans la couverture du complotisme aussi, un petit peu comme les décrypteurs, mais j'ai focalisé beaucoup sur certains des influenceurs complotistes et j'ai enquêté sur eux de façon assez approfondie. Et tout ça a amené, j'ai publié quelques papiers dès les débuts de la COVID, mais tout ça a amené vers une espèce ça a culminé vers une forme de tension qui grimpait. Puis au mois de novembre, il s'est passé 2 événements simultanés. D'abord, il y a un des leaders au sujet de qui j'avais écrit quelques fois. J'avais écrit sur des problèmes judiciaires qu'il y avait, qui était indépendant de la COVID, mais je pense qu'il n'a pas du tout aimé mon article et il a décidé de publier mon numéro de téléphone donc sur Facebook. Donc, c'est une forme de doxing. Il a publié mon numéro de téléphone et celui de Yves Poirier de TVA. Dans le cas de Yves, ça a été catastrophique. Il a reçu des centaines d'appels téléphoniques de menaces, d'insultes dans les heures qui ont suivi. Ça a duré tout un week-end Vraiment, c'était une pluie d'appels. Moi, j'ai été un peu plus chanceux, étant de la presse écrite, donc peut-être moins visible. J'ai reçu quelques messages, dont des menaces carrément. Notamment, un type m'a écrit, je m'excuse, c'est vulgaire, mais tu sais, ça doit pas être facile d'être dans tes shorts. Tu dois chier dans tes shorts quand tu pars ton auto le matin avec des dessins de bombes. Évidemment, tout ça, ça fait réfléchir. Évidemment, quand on sort de chez soi, on se met à regarder un petit peu toujours autour, voir s'il n'y a pas des individus louches qui seraient là. Je n'ai jamais cru que la personne qui m'avait écrit ça pouvait mettre une bombe sous ma voiture, mais ça rend nerveux et ça a un effet d'autocensure assez majeur sur notre désir d'écrire. Tu sais, c'est un frein important, je pense, puis c'est voulu. C'est ça l'effet qui est recherché. Dans ce cas-là, moi et Yves, on a décidé de porter plainte à la police. La police a pris la chose très au sérieux et quelques heures plus tard, donc cette personne-là était arrêtée. C'est important de dire que cette personne-là, ce leader-là, complotiste, c'est un ancien policier lui-même. Et donc, il a été arrêté et accusé de harcèlement avec des technologies. C'est toujours devant les tribunaux. Je vais me réserver un petit peu de commenter davantage parce que c'est en train de se négocier. Il y a des chances qu'il y ait une plaidoyer de culpabilité, des choses comme ça, puis ça réglerait. Mais je veux juste souligner à quel point ça, c'est formidable. Les policiers ont pris ça au sérieux. Mes patrons ont pris ça très au sérieux aussi. On m'a encouragé à porter plainte, puis je pense que c'était la chose à faire, mais ça a un effet négatif, c'est-à-dire que la justice lui a imposé des conditions de mise en liberté, dont une de ne pas s'approcher de moi, de ne pas entrer en contact avec moi. Mais moi, de facto, ça fait en sorte que ça rend difficile ma propre couverture. Je veux dire, si lui ne peut pas entrer en contact avec moi, si moi j'entre en contact avec lui, est-ce qu'il peut être considéré comme dans une position délicate? Donc, ça, je pense que ça a été une partie du problème. L'autre élément que j'aimerais soulever, c'est que dans la même période, je couvrais aussi un autre leader complotiste assez important, puis qui lui, était plus dans une mouvance véritablement complotiste. C'est quelqu'un qui affirme depuis longtemps que la direction de la protection de la jeunesse est un réseau d'enlèvement d'enfants, donc qui évoque des thèses un petit peu pédosatanistes d'une certaine façon. Donc, j'ai commencé à m'intéresser à son parcours devant les tribunaux. C'est un plaideur quérulent, une personne qui utilise des arguments pseudo-juridiques devant les tribunaux et qui était à ce moment-là très, très actif pour faire déposer des accusations criminelles contre Horacio Arruda et François Legault pour les faire arrêter. Et c'est une personne qui prétend qu'il peut faire des arrestations citoyennes, qui connaît la jurisprudence qui permet de le faire. Et moi, j'ai commencé à m'intéresser à cette personne-là en allant suivre devant les tribunaux ce qui se passait avec elle, un petit peu ses déboires devant les tribunaux. Et à la sortie de la cour, quand j'ai commencé à le questionner, bien, cette personne-là s'est mise à me filmer en direct et à m'insulter, à m'engueuler comme du poisson pourri, à me traiter de tous les noms, de trous de cul, de sale mondialiste, de tout ce que vous voulez. Mais tout ça était diffusé en direct devant, à ce moment-là, 200-300 personnes de ses fans qui le suivaient. Il faut comprendre que ces gens-là, et de plus en plus, ce n'est pas juste les complotistes ou les anti-masques qui vont utiliser cette méthode-là, mais les gens qui n'aiment pas les journalistes vont faire comme ils le font avec les policiers, filmer en direct l'intervention ou l'interaction qu'ils ont avec les journalistes. Et ça a eu un effet assez considérable, c'est-à-dire que je me demandais si j'avais bien réagi. Tu te retrouves avec quelqu'un qui cherche carrément une confrontation, à t'insulter dans la rue, tu marches dans la rue, puis il te traite de trou de cul, tu te retournes journaleux, tout ce que tu veux. Il était agressif, il voulait quelque part que tout le monde me disait, tu as été fort de ne pas le frapper, là, de ne pas réagir tellement que c'était violent. Et ça a comme déclenché par la suite une espèce de raz-de-marée de courriels haineux, de propos haineux sur ma page Facebook personnelle. Des gens sont venus jusqu'à commenter en dessous des photos d'Halloween de mes enfants, des choses comme en me disant « Mon Dieu, c'est de la propagande ». Bref. Et j'ai continué, ça ne m'a pas empêché de continuer à couvrir les déboires de cette personne-là devant les tribunaux, qui en avait beaucoup, et qui s'est retrouvé donc avec plusieurs plaintes de nature criminelle, civile. À un moment donné, il s'est fait arrêter parce qu'il n'a pas respecté les ordonnances. Il s'est retrouvé en prison pendant 4 mois. Mais assez rapidement, cette personne-là s'est mise à dire devant les juges que c'était de ma faute s'il était devant les tribunaux, que j'avais essayé d'influencer le barreau du Québec, que j'étais payé par le barreau du Québec. Et il demandait aux juges de prononcer des ordonnances pour m'interdire d'écrire à son sujet. Et heureusement, je pense que la justice est quand même assez clairvoyante. Là. Je veux dire, il n'y a pas un juge qui a décidé de mettre fin à la liberté de presse pour autant. Mais on peut voir à quel point ça devient vite personnel pour ces gens-là et ça devient vite, ils utilisent tous les moyens qu'ils peuvent. Et cette personne-là avait dans son entourage, bon, ils sont connus, c'est des complotistes connus au Québec qui s'appellent les Farfadas, là, qui est un groupe un peu plus radical. Bien, cette personne-là, quand elle passait devant les tribunaux, systématiquement, elle avait cet entourage qui venait assister à ses causes et qui, eux, faisaient de l'intimidation physique avec moi dans le palais de justice, à faire des barrières humaines pour m'empêcher de rentrer dans les salles de tribunaux. Et là, il a fallu que les autorités interviennent. Donc, ça peut déraper dans ce sens-là assez vite.
Je comprends. À vous entendre tous les quatre, en fait, je vais vous dire qu'il nous reste déjà très peu de temps, mais je suis vraiment frappée à quel point que c'est très grave et lourd ce que vous avez à porter au quotidien. Et pour le temps qui nous reste, je vais peut-être vous poser 2 questions. Je vais prendre peut-être un de vos réflexes journalistes, 2 questions en une. C'est-à-dire, de vous entendre sur les discussions que vous avez eues, notamment avec vos patrons, avec les gestionnaires. On va les entendre tout à l'heure pour voir comment on vous a appuyé, tout ça. Puis l'autre élément, c'est de vous entendre davantage sur tout l'aspect de solitude, de tout ça, de vivre ça et l'impact sur votre santé mentale. Alors, peut-être sur ces 2 aspects-là, I want to start with you, Omaira, as you spoke to that point a few minutes ago.
These are really great questions. I'll start with the first one. I have to say that I had an incredible support from my managers from the moment that I received those messages. They called me, I received incredible messages from colleagues. And so that was something that helped break that cycle of isolation that you feel when you receive targeted messages. You feel like you're alone, you feel a little bit secluded. And so that messaging was very positive for me. And there's also a reassurance that there will be a way of finding methods to counter this. And so that's why I'm very reassured by this conference. I think this is a very positive signaling around how this is not acceptable, and it does have an impact on people. I think it's particularly important to show solidarity among journalists. That was one of the things that made a huge difference for me, is hearing from racialized journalists all across different media, all across the industry, and my colleagues as well within the organization coming forward and telling me that they support me. And as for your second question on, could you remind me what your second question is?
Well, I was asking you about what you would like to see, like in terms of on your mental health and the impact with the managers. Those are the 2 aspects. But I think you pretty much cover both.
Sure, that sounds good.
Thank you. If I could move to you, Joanna, on those 2 perspectives, and first maybe how you felt. I know you spoke earlier a little bit about, when your interactions with police. Tristan spoke to that as well. What about within the newsroom, within your bosses? How did that work out? If I could ask you guys all briefly, because I want everybody to get a chance to hear everyone on that.
Yeah, like I mentioned, it was our public editor. So our newspaper has a public editor who asked me, who keeps a file of all the emails I send to him and cases to tell him about. And it was his encouragement of my company's in-house lawyer that pushed me to go to the police. Again, I was disappointed by the police reaction, but I do feel it was so worth doing so in case something does happen in the future. At least local police around me aren't surprised, or they can respond quicker. But it is unfortunate that I need to even think about that. So I've been happy with their support I have in the newsroom. I think many, like Amara said, a lot of racialized journalists in the newsroom have banded together and allies to talk about these issues and make sure it's not something that the main targets among us are suffering alone. I've had colleagues who have done things like offer to take over the Twitter account of someone who's getting a storm of attacks to monitor the messages for possibly threats to report to police. Because something I wanted to point out is that it's very tiring because you can't simply ignore it when you're, hundreds of messages are coming at you, because one of them, might be a doxing attack. It might be a picture of your home. There is like a need to monitor that, and actually something colleagues can do is to take on that burden for someone who is experiencing it, so they don't have to do it themselves. I would also like to point out that some of the death threats I received were in Chinese, or they were in different languages. So my editors did discuss with me that they suspect that some of it might come from out of Canada. Again, I mentioned this to police and they weren't able to do anything about it. They don't have capacity to investigate harassment that comes from within Canada, let alone from outside Canada. And it's unfortunate because in my research, I've seen that foreign states have used online harassment to try to stifle criticism all over the world. And that is a well-known and documented phenomenon that happens. So it's unfortunate in Canada. In many countries, we don't have the basic structures to try to investigate what's going on and to identify even when threats are coming from out of Canada.
Wow, thank you for that. Bouchra?
Oui, moi, je dirais en fait, je pense que c'est une situation qui était nouvelle pour nous, les journalistes. Je pense aussi que c'était quand même relativement nouveau pour nos patrons de faire face à autant de menaces, des menaces de mort, d'avoir appelé la police. Je dirais qu'ils nous ont supportés. Je pense qu'avec le temps, peut-être ça va être... pas devenir une habitude, mais je pense que là aussi, c'était quand même perturbant pour eux de devoir à gérer ça pour la première fois. Là. Mais c'est ça, c'est quand même, je pense que ça a causé quand même beaucoup de stress à certains de mes collègues. Je pense qu'il y en a eu qui ont eu besoin de prendre quelques jours de congé. Donc, je pense d'être aussi... compréhensif à ça, parce que c'est le genre de situation que même quand ta journée de travail finit, si tu as reçu des menaces de mort, si tu as quelqu'un qui menace de te doxer, ça te suit en dehors du travail. Là. Donc, des fois, d'avoir la possibilité de prendre un peu de recul. Puis maintenant qu'on sait que ça peut aller assez loin, je pense qu'on pourra mieux s'y préparer en amont.
Super. Et toi, Christian? Les discussions avec...
Oui, moi, je dois dire, la réaction des patrons a été vraiment formidable. Tu sais, d'emblée, on m'a dit, est-ce que tu te sens en sécurité? Est-ce que tu sens que tu peux continuer? Est-ce que tu veux continuer à couvrir ce secteur-là? J'ai eu un accès aussi, je pense que c'est pas à négliger, j'ai eu un accès direct au directeur du contentieux, au vice-président, l'avocat responsable de ces questions-là à la presse, pour toujours essayer d'évaluer, tu sais, quand il se passe quelque chose, qu'est-ce que tu en penses d'un point de vue légal? Est-ce qu'on devrait aller plus loin? Et d'avoir ces discussions-là, je dirais que ça m'a beaucoup aidé. Les collègues aussi qui, je pense, ont pris rapidement conscience du niveau de stress que je vivais et j'en ai beaucoup discuté et vraiment, ça compte pour beaucoup. Aussi, une chose que je tiens, qui est importante, moi, j'ai eu des discussions avec des personnes chez Facebook aussi, à un moment donné, parce que les insultes venaient sur mon compte et je me suis fait suspendre mon compte à un moment donné pour une raison tout à fait absurde que je ne comprenais pas. Puis, visiblement, c'était des plaintes qui avaient été logées de façon multiple. C'était organisé par des gens qui ont décidé d'attaquer mon compte. Et chez Facebook, on m'a dit, on a mis un statut spécial un petit peu sur ton compte où on a clairement identifié que tu es un journaliste et que l'information que tu transmets est généralement véridique et vérifiée. Donc, ça a calmé beaucoup le jeu par la suite. Ce genre d'attaque-là, c'est calmé. Puis je pense que les journalistes, malheureusement, il n'y a pas de procédure officielle pour le faire, là, mais les journalistes devraient savoir que si on s'identifie comme tel, comme journaliste professionnel vérifié qui respecte des normes, c'est important que les réseaux sociaux le sachent et ça peut faire une différence aussi à quelque part.
Super. Merci Tristan, merci Omaira, Joanna et Bouchra. En quelque sorte, Tristan, tes derniers propos ont mis la table pour la discussion avec les leaders, avec les gestionnaires. Mais avant de passer la parole aux gestionnaires, je veux vraiment vous remercier, hein, à la fois pour votre candeur, votre franchise. Je pense que vous nous avez aidé à vraiment comprendre la réalité du terrain, mais aussi à nous motiver à trouver des solutions. On sait que ce n'est pas facile, c'est complexe, mais encore une fois, votre courage et votre ouverture à nous présenter la réalité nous aide à avancer. Alors, merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous.
Merci.
So, wow, that was really very moving to hear the experience, the Canadian experience. And now we'll have in the Leaders Challenges, have the opportunity to hear what's happening in our newsrooms and how our newsrooms and leaders are dealing with online harassment. So we're already behind time. Without further introduction, let me present to you our participants in the next roundtable. Tout d'abord, François Cardinal, vice-président à l'information et éditeur adjoint à la presse. Bonjour, François. Wendy. Bonjour. Wendy Freeman, president of CTV News. Hello, Wendy. As well as Cheryl McKenzie, executive director of news and current affairs at APTN, and Ward Smith, senior vice president at Global News. As well as Luce Julien, directrice générale de l'information à Radio-Canada. Good afternoon, I still could say, or good morning, depending on where you are, to everybody. Thanks again, et merci à tout le monde de votre participation. Je pense qu'on a été d'entrée de jeu très touchés, en fait, par les témoignages à la fois des journalistes, de ce qu'ils vivent sur le terrain. Mais vous savez qu'on a vu récemment à quel point que l'industrie a été capable de réagir rapidement. I feel like I'd like to start with you, maybe Wendy, if you could speak to us of how did that happen, that the industry was able to move so quickly after the Bernier tweet in September, where the doxing took place? How did that come together?
Could I go first, or?
Yes, Wendy, yeah.
So it's interesting. I had about a week before this had happened, I had started to start conversations with some of my colleagues from the CBC and Global, et cetera, just because we had seen that this vitriol was getting worse and worse against our journalists. So when this happened that day, that conversation had already begun, and we all reached out and we all agreed that, you know, as we said, solidarity is so important, and attention is a weapon. And this is so important, and we have to call out the instigators. So I got on the phone and I just started calling everyone, and we all agreed that we should get united and do this. And as I said, attention, that's a way to get back, and we have to fight back. So it was great too that everyone did get together, and just this conference today shows us how important this is to fight this.
And that it is an opportunity as well to be able to everybody work together, and we can see that industry is able to do that. And certainly this is an occasion where that it is important.
And we're more powerful together.
Absolutely, 100%. Peut-être entendre Luce Julien. Luce, tout à l'heure, on entendait dans le témoignage de Bouchra toute la réalité lorsqu'elle était à l'émission des décrypteurs. J'ai comme envie de t'entendre sur la réalité des salles de nouvelles. Comment ça fait longtemps que tu étais dans l'industrie. Comment la situation a évolué dans la salle des nouvelles, entre autres?
D'abord, je veux faire comme toi, Yolande, remercier les reporters, remercier les journalistes qui ont témoigné, parce que c'est fondamental, de les écouter, de les entendre, et surtout, si nous ne savons rien, on ne peut pas les soutenir. Alors, je trouve ça assez extraordinaire d'avoir entendu leur témoignage. Je te dirais, je réfléchissais pendant que j'écoutais les témoignages et je me disais, wow, c'est hallucinant comment, effectivement, puis j'en reparlerai tout à l'heure, la pandémie a été la tempête parfaite, c'est ce que tu as utilisé comme terme tout à l'heure, mais c'est sûr que la présence sur les réseaux sociaux, on parle de plateformes numériques, on les alimente aussi de nos contenus, mais la présence de nos journalistes sur les réseaux sociaux, nécessairement, et on tient à ce qu'ils y soient aussi. Mais c'est certain que on vit dans une société où la polarisation des débats est extrêmement exacerbée, et nos journalistes qui couvrent ces enjeux-là en sont en quelque sorte victimes. Et c'est certain que dans le cas, et Bouchra a été éloquente à cet égard-là tout à l'heure, dans le cas de l'équipe des décrypteurs, traquer la désinformation, évidemment, on est au cœur de la tempête, c'est le cas de le dire, parce que la désinformation est nourrie par quoi? La colère, l'émotion, etc. Et il ciblait nécessairement nos journalistes. Et donc, c'est certain qu'en ligne, l'équipe des décrypteurs a été vraiment victime de tout cela. Mais je dirais un mot sur nos équipes terrain. Et j'entends là-dessus toutes nos équipes terrain, les caméramans, nos journalistes qui ont été la cible durant les manifestations au printemps dernier. À juste titre, nos caméramans, à un moment donné, nous ont dit, nous, on ne va pas couvrir aujourd'hui la manifestation, puisqu'ils étaient victimes d'insultes directement, même dans certains cas, on leur touchait, etc. Donc, on a tenté, pas on a tenté, mais on a mis en place vraiment des sessions de briefing et débriefing chaque jour de couverture. On a réfléchi au type de couverture aussi qu'on devait faire. La question du direct, évidemment, quand on a une chaîne d'information en continu, est-ce qu'on va en direct sur ces événements-là? Donc, toute l'équipe de gestionnaires, mais aussi avec notre équipe conseil en sécurité, mes collègues, on a vraiment fait plusieurs rencontres avec nos employés aussi. Il y a eu des centaines d'employés même qui ont participé à nos sessions d'information. Mais je pense que le mot-clé, c'est on doit être au courant, information, l'information doit circuler pour qu'on puisse les soutenir absolument.
Je fais le lien avec la présentation qu'on a entendue ce matin, notamment avec vous êtes confrontés d'une certaine façon. C'est sûr qu'on sait que ces menaces-là, en quelque part, c'est pour arrêter les journalistes, c'est pour essayer de bloquer le travail qui doit être fait. Donc, vous êtes dans une situation où vous devez protéger l'expression, puis la liberté d'expression, puis surtout protéger les journalistes et concilier les deux. En quelque part, c'est extrêmement difficile, peut-être entendre François Cardinal sur cet enjeu-là. Comment vous réussissez à concilier les deux choses dans le contexte actuel? Facile comme question, hein?
C'est pas une question facile, d'autant que, Yolande, je trouve qu'il y a un angle dont on n'a pas encore beaucoup parlé, qui a été plus une priorité chez nous à la presse. Je suis content d'avoir entendu Tristan tantôt dire qu'il avait l'appui de ses patrons, et c'est vrai. Chaque cas a été pris très au sérieux, mais je trouve que l'angle mort, peut-être dans nos discussions, quand on parle de harcèlement en ligne, ce sont les courriels, parce qu'on parle beaucoup des réseaux sociaux. Mais les réseaux sociaux, les journalistes peuvent quand même y échapper. Je connais, moi, certains journalistes dans ma salle, surtout des femmes, qui ne vont plus sur Twitter ou qui ne vont plus sur Facebook parce qu'elles sont tannées du harcèlement. Mais c'est beaucoup plus difficile d'échapper à ces courriels. Les courriels, ils rentrent tous les jours et ils rentrent souvent sur son iPhone, même le samedi matin quand on ouvre les yeux. Et j'ai deux exemples récents où les courriels ont été beaucoup plus dommageables que les réseaux sociaux. Je pense à mes journalistes qui couvraient le Canadien. Okay? Vous savez comme moi que le hockey est une religion au Québec. Lors de la Coupe Stanley, la dernière ronde, les commentaires des lecteurs étaient tellement durs que mes journalistes avaient peur de publier leur texte le lendemain sur le hockey. Là, on ne parle même pas d'antivax, on parle de hockey et ils devenaient trop prudents même dans leur texte de crainte de recevoir des hordes de commentaires. Puis les courriels, c'était « t'es un trou de cul, suce ma mère de ce titre pas bon parce que tu as écrit que le Canadien était bon alors qu'il n'était pas bon. » Je veux dire, vraiment, là, c'était la folie furieuse. Puis un autre exemple, c'est Patrick Lagacé qui a écrit sur le passeport vaccinal. Puis tantôt, Catherine Tate parlait des attaques coordonnées. Je ne sais pas au Canada anglais, mais au Québec, on en a de plus en plus souvent des attaques coordonnées. Et dans ce cas-là, pour la chronique de Patrick Lagacé, ils ont mis mon nom, mes coordonnées, etc. sur un blog et j'ai reçu 400 courriels, à peu près tous les mêmes, mais ça peut devenir lourd à la longue, ces courriels-là. Donc, la priorité à la presse, ça a été de trouver une solution technologique pour les courriels. Et ce qu'on a fait, c'est créer des boîtes différentes. Donc, une boîte avec une adresse de courriel qui est celle qui circule sur le web ou qui est en dessous des articles. Et cette boîte-là, les journalistes peuvent décider d'aller la consulter ou pas. Ils peuvent la consulter aussi au moment où ils sont prêts à le faire. Un samedi matin, parce que tu as publié une chronique d'opinion très forte, tu n'as peut-être pas envie de recevoir 250 courriels de colère, mais peut-être le lundi à 9 h avec ton café, tu es beaucoup plus prêt à les recevoir. Donc, nous, la priorité dans la dernière année, ça a vraiment été les courriels. Je dirais que si les réseaux sociaux sont comme la nouvelle place publique, j'ai l'impression que les courriels sont un peu les égouts de cette place publique-là.
C'est intéressant de t'entendre là-dessus parce qu'on a souvent l'impression que j'entends les enfants dire les courriels, c'est plus à jour, mais pour les journalistes, ça reste quand même une source importante de source d'information, justement. If we could hear from you, Ward, I was thinking about how difficult it is, as Julie and David in their presentation were talking about, and I believe Catherine Tate in her speech as well, how it's so difficult for journalists that a lot of journalists are even leaving the profession. So how are you able to reassure, support in an environment that is extremely, as we've heard from the journalists, extremely difficult to live?
Well, it's tragic, really, what's taking place. And we have witnessed firsthand some of the failings we've had as an organization in supporting our team members. And I don't think that, what we know today is what we knew in 2017 or 2018. The confluence of Trump, the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, all of this has really put so many people in a fragile and isolated situation. And what we've, always sort of recognized is, consider the source. A lot of these social media organizations treat facts the same as lies. And we know in journalism there is a difference. But when it comes to the frontline people who are receiving these threats, and it's ongoing and it's exacerbated, as everybody's pointed out, it's very disrupting to their work, to their lives, to their mental well-being. And so to say that we care foremost about the well-being and the safety of our employees is one thing. To actually understand what they're facing on a day-to-day basis and come up with concrete action items is something else. And we recognized well over a year ago that so much of our work was embedded with these social media organizations, just the way we set up our businesses. And while it didn't account for a great deal of business, it created a lot of time and concern. So we really moved toward about a year ago a policy of saying, look, you don't have to do this. This is no longer part of your required work. You can if you like, and we'll support you as you do it, but we are not expecting this in your role. We moved links from our webpage, which was driving staff profiles to external social media platforms. Like, why would we do that? It was a simple technical thing to cut that off. We organized and facilitated employee discussions for employees by employees, sharing their concerns and their worries, and this whole idea of talking about it and not feeling isolated was really critical. But it wasn't really enough, to be honest. We moved to move towards social media coordinators, where you could have your content put out there, but not put yourself in direct contact. But moving forward in even this past election that we experienced in Canada, and the reporting and the journalism really unleashed even more attacks despite these efforts. And so we, similar to what Francois was talking about, we looked at the email filtering of people and how we can set this up so that people can set parameters and key words. We looked at digital monitoring with software companies like ZeroFox to really profile this. We took it deeper to our legal teams and to our security teams. All of this to say it doesn't always answer the question how our teams are feeling and are we doing enough? And I would argue that we're really just starting to understand what we haven't done well. And so everything like this particular conference today and the learnings that we're having and the sharing of the ideas, where do we take it next to the platforms themselves. How do we actually really put it over there? Because we are, as you all know, so regulated to the point of having a license, that there are responsibilities of publishing and content and fact-based journalism where these organizations don't have that. And so how do we actually get to the point that we can not only, because so many of our people, they like the brand extension of social media, they find the humor, they learn from the news breaking stories, and it really is at times so hard for them to manage this on their own. So our support has to be, not only personal and perhaps communicated as often as possible, but really it's about how can we create an environment in which we are heard as news divisions and news organizations, and exert the kind of pressure that can lead to meaningful and lasting change for the protection of our journalists.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you speak to how much you're all doing and is how quickly things are moving. So you're trying to keep up and make sure that you're able to protect journalists and that they're able to continue to do their work. You touched on it, so I'm just gonna give you all the opportunity to speak on it. It's probably extremely difficult, but it's been discussed throughout the morning, the platforms. What is their responsibility? How are we as an industry engaging in their responsibility in this discussion? Maybe I will turn to you, Wendy, to speak to that part first.
Well, it's interesting, during COVID, the platforms were very quick to take down anything fake about COVID and the vaccines, yet they're not quick to take down this vitriol that we see. So we need to call them out on that. They're quick to do that, but not to take down this. And as I said earlier, the stronger we are, the more united we are to go after these platforms is really important, and work together to try to take down this stuff. And again, why would they take down this, fake news about COVID, but they don't take down the harassment against our journalists? Someone said to me the other day, well, it's okay to harass journalists. I don't think people understand that it's not okay to harass journalists, because in the end, it chips away at democracy. And as we've said earlier on, people will stop doing stories. They'll stop covering stories because they'll be afraid. I've seen it in this newsroom. I've seen our journalists afraid to cover stories because they know they will be harassed. And this has to stop. And the police and the RCMP and the social media companies have to understand that if journalists can't tell these stories because they're afraid of this harassment, this will chip away at our democracy.
100%. Cheryl, could I hear you on first on your reality and how you feel the responsibility of the platforms that have affected the discussion and our ability to move forward together on this issue?
Yeah, some really great points made by Wendy and Ward. Always find it interesting listening to your experience. For us at APTN, we find like the trolls are really attacking like all Indigenous people as a whole. And that certainly impacts our Indigenous journalists. We talked about journalists who are leaving the profession. Well, we're finding journalists are not even want to come into the profession. So getting more Indigenous journalists at APTN certainly has its challenges. So to see the racism directed at Indigenous peoples as a whole, and then it's directed to the Indigenous media, APTN as a whole, and why do you exist? And you're government funded and we pay our taxes, which is actually not true. We're not government funded media. And then the attacks go on to the content and the people in our stories, the Indigenous people in our stories. So we really have to keep a handle on the comments that are generated on social media. I know other media organizations have moved to closing down the conversation in your stories and in the public comments, because we would always find that, if you're having a good day, don't read the comments, because then you'll be having an even worse day. So we find the attacks against individual journalists really starts as Indigenous peoples as a whole, right. and then it makes their way to Indigenous journalists. And lots of really like highly sexualized content getting through to some of our particularly Indigenous women journalists, which is really troubling. The platforms, yeah, Wendy, that was a great point about them taking down the COVID misinformation around that. But even people who are making anti-colonial statements have found, like, where did their comments go? And multiple people saying, where did my comments go about this certain topic? So it's Indigenous people's comments being taken down, not even journalists. So for us, there's just that added layer of attacking Indigenous people as a whole, and then eventually getting to our individual journalists.
100% in a sense. We were looking back again to this morning's presentation. Indigenous women are at the top of the list in terms of percentage of targeted journalists and doing their work. So as a media company, it is even that much more urgent that we're able to work as an industry on these issues. J'ai une question. Une question du public, comme on dit. Je vais vous la poser, mais je pense que je peux la poser à tout le monde, mais je vais vous la poser à toi, Luce. On demande les stratégies préconisées pour protéger les gestionnaires des réseaux sociaux exposés au quotidien aux commentaires haineux. Tout à l'heure, on parlait, je crois, dans les témoignages que parfois, une des façons de protéger les journalistes, c'est justement d'avoir quelqu'un qui vient d'une certaine façon être le modérateur. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait pour protéger ces gestionnaires-là dans ce contexte-là?
Je pense d'une part que les gestionnaires sont quand même beaucoup moins ciblés, sauf exception que les journalistes, évidemment, sur le terrain. Et je reprends, moi, un peu aussi ce que Wendy disait, d'une part, solidarité entre nous, mais c'est vrai que le métier de journaliste a toujours été un métier assez difficile à pratiquer. Puis je pense, entre autres, aux journalistes d'enquête. Dans certains cas, il y a des journalistes d'enquête qui ont reçu des menaces de mort, etc., etc. Mais aujourd'hui, couvrir simplement une manifestation, couvrir simplement un sujet un peu litigieux devient carrément, effectivement, dans certains cas, périlleux. Et Wendy parlait de la démocratie qui est en quelque sorte en cause. Et moi, c'est ce qui m'inquiète considérablement parce qu'on a tous une pénurie de ressources en ce moment, de journalistes, de professionnels dans notre métier. Et si, effectivement, exercer notre métier devient de plus en plus périlleux ou même dangereux pour sa propre santé mentale, je trouve ça drôlement inquiétant. Mais la clé, cette réunion aujourd'hui est quand même un pas pour soutenir nos journalistes.
Oui. Tout à l'heure, puis je vais peut-être poser la question à François sur Mélus, c'est toi qui l'as abordé, toute la question de la polarisation et comment la polarisation a comme contribué à exacerber le débat. J'avais envie d'entendre François là-dessus.
Tout à l'heure, Yolande, je parlais de mes journalistes qui couvrent le hockey, qui sont attaqués, mais je pense que c'est le fruit de la polarisation et de la colère qui vient aussi de cette polarisation-là. Donc, on vit un moment qui est très difficile en ce moment. Si je rebondis sur l'autre question que tu posais tout à l'heure, Yolande, sur la responsabilité des plateformes, surtout dans un contexte de polarisation, j'avoue quand même ressentir une certaine inquiétude quand j'entends mes collègues dire que ce sont les plateformes qui doivent intervenir. J'ai un petit peu de difficulté à donner ce pouvoir-là aux plateformes parce que parfois, ce sont des cas de harcèlement clair. Et là, oui, je pense que la plateforme doit nécessairement intervenir, surtout si ce sont des menaces de mort, par exemple, ce genre de choses. Mais vous savez comme moi que la frontière entre le harcèlement et la critique est parfois floue. Et je pense que les journalistes, on doit quand même continuer à recevoir la critique sur les réseaux, sur les plateformes. Et donc, est-ce que je veux donner aux plateformes la responsabilité de décider ce qui est publié, ce qui n'est pas publié, ce qui est de l'harcèlement, ce qui est de la simple critique? J'avoue avoir un petit drapeau rouge ici. Un peu, je fais un lien, vous allez peut-être le trouver bancal, mais avec le compte de Donald Trump qui a été banni, par exemple, de Twitter. Je trouve que c'est un gros pouvoir qu'on donne à une plateforme de décider qui a le droit de publier, qui n'a pas le droit de publier, de la même manière que ce qui doit être publié, ce qui ne peut pas l'être, Je ne suis pas certain, moi, que cette responsabilité que nous, on a comme gestionnaire, comme média responsable, je ne suis pas sûr que je veux le donner au Facebook de ce monde. Donc, c'est juste un drapeau rouge, puis peut-être une petite inquiétude de ce point de vue-là.
Je comprends. Ward, did you have that reaction to that in terms of maybe platforms, but then there's also in terms of, if I could add to the mix, public figures who have the doxing, or what is their responsibility in that as well? How do you navigate, as François was talking about, both issues where, yes, we want them to take responsibility, but do you want them to be judge and jury at the same time?
Well,
no.
Thank you for the question. I mean, I feel like, you know, some of these platforms benefit from the polarization, from the exaggeration, you know, the piling on. It really doesn't distinguish, you know, fact from fiction. And the more negative eyeballs, somebody once described it as mobilizing the useful idiots to really build their business by having this extremism. And it's almost the exact opposite, I believe, of some of what we do as journalists, and as even the term broadcast. It's to cast a wider net, to find common ground, to sort of build on values that have been established, whether they're right or not, but to have the accountability around it. So we've had, and I'm sure everybody on this call has had experiences where you're dealing with the platform and they do not see it the same way. Their policies are not clear, as somebody once pointed out. There is all the sort of the benefits of influence and power and economy from their audiences, but not necessarily the responsibility and the standards to which we hold ourselves accountable in terms of self-regulation through practices and principles. So somewhere in here, in my mind, it's not evident that they are capable of actually monitoring and responding in a way that would stamp out the extremism and the racism and the hatred. They benefit from it. The actual economy of their business model needs it and feeds off of it. And so this is the distinction in my mind of what we have. But I would argue that, as it was presented earlier, that there are things that we should do and look at their policies, look at the transparency of how they respond, and what is the level of accountability of fact versus fiction, and some of this responsibility of care for people. And that is what is lost. And so how do we exert or influence that in a meaningful way? I think that there's some real challenges here with these platforms and their responses to our requests, and the acknowledgement that there's even a problem in how it disrupts lives and feeds off of some of the frustration and frankly the mental well-being of people. It's not fair.
Wow. We're already out of time, but I have to, you know, since we all have you here, and again, thank you for taking this time. I want to ask you all one last question. I'm going to start with you, Cheryl. As we think to the next part of our forum coming forward, we're thinking about, you know, it's not easy issues, not easy solutions. Otherwise, you guys would have all done it. Everybody would have taken care of it together. But we started our conversation talking about how industry was able to work together. But if you had to talk about I won't ask you the one thing, one of the things that you would like to see the industry do together to really move forward on this issue, what would that be, Cheryl?
Well, I think this event certainly helps, and to give journalists in the newsrooms, you know, an opportunity to see that they're not alone, and that we are very concerned about what we can do, and trying to put our heads together about what can be done, because I find Indigenous journalists in other media organizations like the CTV and CBC and Global, like I find they get a lot more trolls than we do at APTN, and I think it just has to do with the volume of the audience and who's tuning in to those audiences. So it would be good for us to have forums where the journalists can come together to talk a little bit more, and like others have said, bring the conversation more out into the open.
And normalize that conversation. So important to be able to do that and to make sure that everybody feel supported. And again, that's one of the objectives of this forum, so that journalists know that they're not alone and are supported in that. On that note, je vois, malheureusement, c'est tout le temps que nous avons. Je vous aurais gardé toute la journée, mais encore une fois, merci beaucoup pour votre générosité puis d'avoir encore une fois pris le temps puis de votre engagement. On va poursuivre la conversation. Je vais aussi remercier encore une fois tous les journalistes qui ont eu le courage de nous partager leur expérience avec nous cet avant-midi. C'était enregistrant et ça nous a vraiment permis de poursuivre la discussion tous ensemble. Alors là-dessus, Hannah, I don't know about you, but I'm certainly feeling invigorated by the conversations that we've had already this morning as we look forward.
Absolutely, Yolande. And wow, what a wide-ranging conversation it's been. Thank you, Yolande, for that. The stories I think we heard today were so sobering and so compelling. We're so grateful to everybody who shared their testimonies so bravely. You've reminded us, you and the leaders who shared their insights as well, have reminded us of the importance of normalising the conversations across the industry and standing together to say that online harassment is not okay. As Yolande said earlier, if you have suffered online, please make sure to talk to someone you trust and use the resources available to you within your organisation. For those in Canada, we're going to share the crisis service numbers on the screen now. For those elsewhere, we'll share resources which might help on the website of the conference. Today's conversation set the scene for next Tuesday's session around how we as an industry can work together to address the threat. And next week, we'll also release the results of an industry-wide Ipsos survey on online harassment against media professionals, the first of its kind in Canada. I'm just going to take 2 minutes now to synthesize what we've heard today so we can move forward in terms of practical tips and steps as well, I think. So just in terms of what we heard today, I think what we heard was the extent and scale of this, how certain journalists are more impacted by online violence, and specifically those who have been most historically marginalised by the media and by society as well. And also how wide-ranging this is, how it's increased during COVID, and how it's connected to disinformation campaigns and often orchestrated campaigns orchestrated by politicians as well. What stood out, I think, was the fact that it has a real life impact on individuals. We heard about how you turn your phone on in the morning first thing and you don't have any kind of protective shield around you, and suddenly you're hit by this barrage of abuse. That's incredibly difficult for your mental resilience. But as well as the individuals, it's having an impact on our organizations as journalists as well. And beyond that, as the industry, we heard from David and Julie about the knock-on impact in terms of expression and freedom of expression, and how journalists are leaving our industry, which is horrifying. We're already struggling with media plurality in journalism, and we're losing those who we most need. And that really is really difficult to see happen. And I think one of the things for me that was really interesting, and certainly I know this from my experience, is how isolating these experiences can be, how often we feel alone, and particularly when we don't have the privilege of support in a kind of obvious way, and how therefore important that is to have that solidarity. Just very briefly, I'll just a couple of things. If we can remember ahead of next week, you're not alone. You are not alone. You are surrounded by us, and we have solidarity that we've heard here in many different ways today. Voices, it's not acceptable to silence voices. It is acceptable to normalize this conversation. It's not part of your job to have to endure online violence as a journalist. And just briefly, 2 or 3 points in terms of practical points I'd like to mention. I used to run a journalism safety charity. When we sent journalists into war zones, we'd give them flak jackets and we'd give them these bulletproof vests. We'd do risk assessments with them. We'd help them understand the tools they needed to go into war zones. I know that some people feel uncomfortable with this notion that this is a war zone, and I recognise that, but I feel like we've heard from news organisations today that many people are instilling policies and training and resources for journalists to help them understand the risks that they face, to help encourage them to build up an emotional flak jacket, if you want to use that term, which is one that I use to support them. Just 2 more points. Yes to solidarity in terms of holding platforms to account. Absolutely, we need to be holding the platforms really to account, and we can do that much more strongly together. and yes to the fact that any journalists who are experiencing this kind of online harassment, please, I can't reinforce enough how much you're not alone, and how, where possible, let's try to create those spaces both within our small communities and our newsrooms to try to help people feel safer to speak about their experiences. That is a lot of me talking. I'm extremely grateful to all of you for bearing with us, for walking alongside us in this fantastic conversation today. I'm immensely privileged to be part of this. Thank you, Yolande, and I do hope that you will all join us next week to carry on this conversation. Thanks, everybody.